WoW class breakdown. Which class is right for you? You want to have fun and play with your friends, but the class balance changes so much you just don't know what to choose anymore. Let me solve that problem. Not only will you have the right class, but you will also understand all of the other classes and how you can enjoy every single one of them. The Death Knight is a unique class. It clearly embodies the death theme and class fantasy and flavor, which is that's for you, then Death Knight is the right pick and you can go right into it. And you have a couple of really cool options because it has one of the simplest tanks you can play, also a simple melee DPS and a complex, but let's call it satisfying melee DPS as well. It's tanky as a class, regardless of what spec you play. You have incredible defensives, a lot of HP and a lot of armor, but as a consequence, you're also a little bit slow. A lot slow actually, probably the slowest class in the game, with maybe Paladin as well. Usually DKs are pretty slow, but your utility is incredible and it does a good job at making you feel unstoppable. Ever heard of the saying, the immovable object meets the unstoppable force? Well, are you both? Well, let's call you the immovable object, because it is incredible how much you can withstand and actually become the type of player that can say, man, I just don't give a fuck about all of this stuff, because Icebound Fortitude can stop and break stuns. Anti-magic shell can stop and completely immune magical effects. That's advanced essentially makes you immune movement impairing effects that push you around and grip you around, which makes you just like, hey man, I don't know, I just am not gonna move from this point and there's nothing you can do about it. Lichborn essentially makes you immune to fears and charms, so you can just negate a lot of stuff, and that's how essentially you will feel as a Death Knight. Not to mention that you can embody the theme of the frost and just slap targets with very big two-hander attacks with the obliteration build, or even breathe the breath of Sindragosa's frosty icicle damages on your enemies. And if you want to be a little bit more complex, you can hop into Unholy and actually play out with all of the undeads all out in the world. Ghouls, skeletons, mages, gargoyles, abominations, you name them, you get to summon them and just smash them into your enemies. And you also have diseases and festering wounds and bursting swords that just explode in an AoE fantastic gory show. And of course you can top it off with Blood Death Knight, the truly solo tank. You don't have to rely on anybody because all of the damage that you take as a tank, you get to heal yourself. The solo Sigma class that is Death Knight. So cool and awesome that I want to see it again and again and again in all of its glory. And I do it super easy and fast with Allplay. I get all my runs recorded with just a push of a button. That way I can even analyze it and figure out what I am doing wrong when playing Unholy. The app is free and easy to install. Just click the link in the description or comments and you will be directed to the download page. Plus you will be supporting the channel and this video. Follow the steps and in a few minutes it will be set up for WoW and ready to go. There are a lot of options to explore based on what you want to record. Not to mention editing and clipping your recordings is also possible and super fast for those times when you want to share your moments with your buddies. Thank you Allplay for sponsoring this video and making recording content a beautifully simple process. And speaking of beauty, we cannot talk about it without actually mentioning the beauty of nature, the tranquility of the forest, the Druid class that is the embodiment of everything and all things versatile. You can be a tank, melee DPS, range DPS, and a healer all in one class with each individual spec. Not to mention that the Druid is essentially similar to the Death Knight in a sense where shapeshifting essentially removes pretty much all movement impairing effects. You cannot be stopped as a Druid. You can negate a lot of these effects as well, and a lot of polymorph effects as well by actually being, you know, a beast of your own. And each beast gives you specific bonuses, where the bear with its subclass guardian makes you into a tank, or at least tanky if you're a different specialization. You have a lot of HP and a lot of armor, and it is one of the simplest tanks to actually play if you do decide to go on the bear, and likely right now still the strongest tank in the game. The cat, the feral, is essentially the melee DPS. If you ever played Rogue, you might find this very familiar because you are building combo points and spending your combo points with your energy on bites and rips, essentially big finishers or bleeding your target to death, which is very, very satisfying. Not to mention my personal favorite, the balanced Druid, the caster of the Druid. You essentially just fire moons and stars and arcane celestial bodies at your enemies by juggling damage over time effects and a lot of damage windows through the eclipses. And last but not least, the restoration spec, which is obviously the healer since that's the only one left, embodies pretty much everything at all. You will essentially just be in a regular caster humanoid form, but you will have access to all of the shapeshifting forms depending on what you want. If you want to be tanky to survive a damage event, you can be a bear. If you want to move around really quick, you can hop into a cat and dash around. If you want to just do damage at range, you can go into your moonkin form, have a little bit of armor, and still fire off your big arcane celestial spells. Not to mention all the heals are heal over time and instant, giving you a lot of freedom to move around and cast whatever you want to cast through whatever shapeshifting form you want to go into. Following the Druid, we have to mention the Evoker. This is the new class, and with the current state of the game, you have 3 specs to choose from. They're pretty much all range. You have the Devastation, which is probably what you would expect a dragon caster to be, where you just fire dragon breaths and arcane and fire magic at your enemies. It is very explosive and very satisfying. Augmentation, which is the new kid on the block that has changed the gameplay, essentially turned the game on its head, upside down, whatever you want to call it. Augmentation is the only support spec. It's still a DPS, but it offers incredible support. Your damage singularly is very low, but you boost your party's damage by such a tremendous amount that you are probably the best single DPS spec in the game if you count all of this into your overall performance. And if you want to have an intricate healer, you can play with time magic and be a preservation evoker and actually heal your parties with time anomalies and rewinding time altogether, or even breathe green dragon magic on your party members and raid members. And all in all, whichever spec you play, the evoker is still a dragon. You can fly around, breathe around, you can flap your wings and soar and do all of the dragony stuff that makes a dragon class be really fun and enjoyable. Or you can hop into something a little bit more traditional, the Hunter. Hunter is probably the most popular class in the game, period. It is probably one of the simplest one as well, because you are shooting at range with 2 of the 3 specs. And Beast Mastery is the quintessential beginner-friendly spec, and it's not even just for beginners, because it is very satisfying to play Beast Mastery since it is the only range DPS spec and the only spec in the game, period, that can do everything on the move. You never have to stop moving, and moving does not interrupt anything that you do, which is fantastic. The amount of freedom that you feel from playing Beast Mastery is unparalleled with any other spec in the game. It is simplistic, you are safe, you have maximum range and maximum control over the battlefield. It is fantastic, and that just goes to everything that the Hunter does. You have, as a Hunter, I believe, all of the crowd controls in the game. You have slows, roots, stuns, fears, incapacitates, everything that you want, you have it as a Hunter. You can knock things away, or you can jump back on your own, you can grapple or dash around. Everything that any other class can do, usually Hunters can do as well. And we're talking also about survival, which is the melee version of the Hunter. And although it might be a little bit strange to play a Hunter that is melee, you have some pretty cool interactions with your pet and the way you do damage. You throw bombs around and you just maim and butcher and carve all of your enemies around you with your spear. It is fantastic, while marksmanship retains the sniper feel. It has the most amount of range out of all of the specs in the game because its mastery just gives it a lot of range. You can essentially, with enough gear, outrange all of the mechanics designed in WoW. You don't ever have to be hit by any breath or fire circle or anything like that. And we cannot talk about traditional stuff without talking about Mage, because Mage is pretty much part of the trifecta for any RPG game out there. And you have the quintessential Fire, Frost, and Arcane specializations for Mage, which each does individually amazing thing. It is one of the flashiest spec, one of the most explosive classes in the game that embodies each of these 3 elements fantastically by each spec. Not to mention, the Mage is, although sounds ironically, the smartest class in the game in the way that you're using utility and your survivability. You can have invisibility and just dodge completely all the mechanics in combat encounters if you just don't feel feel like it. You can immune a lot of stuff with Ice Block and just not take any damage possible. You offer your team with the biggest buff possible, which is the Time Warp or the Bloodlust effect that just gives 30% haste to everybody. You're indispensable to your group. You can summon clones, you can freeze stuff, you can blink away and just smartly, neatly dodge all of the mechanics and anything that's out to get you. This is Mage, and it could be your choice. On the opposite side of the spectrum, one of maybe the least played classes is the Monk, and it boggles my mind because Monk is a very, very fun class altogether. If you have seen Kung Fu Panda the movie, this is basically the class made right after it. You can be a melee DPS, a tank, and a healer, so it does all of the roles. You're just not a ranged DPS caster, but if you do decide to melee, you can punch and kick and spin around and just deal explosive damage to anything around. As a tank, you get to chug brews all day long and be so intoxicated in the video game that you just don't feel the damage in your stagger mechanic in the way that you actually negate that damage that you take. And Mistweaver, one of the more intricate healers and more interesting concepts of a healer, you heal through mists and you blow mists on your target and you get to explode everything with Vivify healing, and you have cocoons and revivals and all of the cool stuff. Not to mention that Monk is probably the most mobile class in the game. You have so many dashes and rolls and chi torpedoes. You have some of the coolest utility ever made in Ring of Peace, where you essentially create a zone that nobody else can walk through. And you can even teleport yourself to your transcendent spirit. Essentially, whatever you thought a monk could do, the monk class can actually do it in WoW. Not to knock any other class out of this list, the Paladin is probably the best designed class, period. Paladin is essentially anything that you thought about a holy warrior or a battle cleric or anything like that. You essentially wear the heaviest armor in the game and hit with the biggest weapons possible. You can be a retribution paladin, which is what is drawing a lot of attention lately, with some of the coolest, flashiest combat animations possible, where you burn and light up your enemies in true Ashbringer-like fashion. And if you want to tank, you can be a protection paladin, where you throw your shield around Captain America style and then you just take close to no damage, even immune entire sections of damage through your divine shield. Or if you ever wanted to be that battle healer, then the Holy Paladin is for you. You essentially get to be in the thick of the thick, in the meatiest parts of combat as a melee healer, where you slap targets around and you heal your party with the power of the light. That is essentially Holy Paladin. And not to mention, in terms of the class as well, it is one of the tankiest classes, also a little bit less mobile than most other classes as well, but you bring probably the most amount of utility to your party. You can pretty much help your friends more than any other class in the game by making them immune, by healing them, by cleansing a lot of stuff off of them, and just by increasing their overall durability to pretty much all damage sources in the game. And speaking of helping your party members, we cannot omit the priest. Now, before I tell you what the priest can do with each specializations, I do have to mention one thing, is that the priest is the universal healer. You also provide probably one of the strongest individual buffs to yourself and an ally of your choosing through Power Infusion, which has pretty much made any priest welcome in any group that you're a part of. Because this buff is so strong, I don't think there's a single player out there that would feel bad about receiving it, because you will be buffing your party members and rejoice at their increased overall damage output, which is pretty cool. Not to mention, you do have 2 healing specs. You can be the Holy Priest, which is probably the most vanilla generic healer that you can play, which is not to knock it off because it is very satisfying. You essentially are the best at filling that HP bar. If somebody takes damage, you can just press a button and blammo, the instant heal is so gratifying. It is fantastic. The Discipline Priest is a more intricate healer if you want to go a little bit deeper into some different kind of playstyles, where you essentially shield your party members, and by applying atonement on them, you can then do damage to your enemies, and that damage is converted into healing, which is something that has established the discipline's flavor into the meta. Not to mention, you get to play with the 2 sides of the coin, the light and the dark, the holy and the shadow, and actually become an even bigger threat to your enemies by doing a lot more damage and using your intricate heals to keep your party alive. This is really cool. And speaking of Shadow, Shadow Priest is one of the top DPSers in the game, and maybe that's not enough. Maybe you don't care about that. You can just care about the fact that you embrace the insanity of the old gods and just fire off void abilities, void monsters, monsters and they just suck the life out of your enemies, while all at the same time audibly in your ears, in your headset, hearing the whispers of the old gods telling you to go crazy with all of that damage. Tell me that doesn't sound satisfying. And if it doesn't, then you can also check out the Rogue. And with the Rogue, you're probably familiar from other games as well. It is the scoundrel, the ninja, the assassin, the outlaw is what you're going to be expecting from the Rogue. You are, let's say, the mage of the melee DPSers. You are the smart melee DPS. You can outmaneuver your opponents through intricate utility kits, through your stealth mechanics, through your incapacitating mechanics and plethora of crowd control abilities. Not to mention that when you actually get to do damage, regardless of the 3 specs that you pick, whether you want to deal poison and bleed damage as assassination and just see your enemies wither away before your very eyes, or be in the shadows with subtlety and throw your ninja stars and explode in AoE bonanza damage, or even be a scoundrel, that pirate that you always wanted to be with outlaw, while slashing your swords and shooting your guns left and right to establish the rule of justice, which is no rule because that's what outlaws live by. And all of this is revolved around in some of the most satisfying melee gameplay that you can ever put your hands onto. The Shaman class is probably the most Warcrafty class that you can think about. It has some of the most creative designs in a class in an RPG possible. From the elemental shaman, where you break the world apart and harness the power of the elements, the fire, the frost, the earth, ice, all of this, and throw it at your enemies with some of the most spectacular sound effects ever. Or you can embrace the ways of the melee enhancement shaman, where you take your hammers and you smash them into your enemies and call down the storms and thunders in one of the most spectacular visually and audible DPS spec ever. Or you can just take the powers of water. The restoration shaman gives you one of the most satisfying and simplest healers to play, where you just throw big splashes of water, which sounds not very healing, but it does actually provide with some of the most satisfying healing animations and spell effects possible to get your party up to snuff. And whichever spec you actually play, the shaman has a plethora of utility, maybe one of the most amount of utilities possible out of any class in the game, through the access to totems. Your totems will essentially do everything that you want. They can stun, they can slow, they can remove fears, they can remove poisons, they can reposition, they can give your party damage, they can give you damage, they can give damage reduction. Anything that you want, totems more or less can do as well. Even restore mana to your fellow healers. The shaman is essentially the jack of all trades of anything that you need to have happen in any combat in World of Warcraft. From the summoning of elementals, whether it's fire for your damage or storm for your damage, still earth to survive a lot of damage and tank things for you. You can even have the quintessential bloodlust ability that I mentioned before, which has been the OG spell for the shamans since the dawns of time of the early Warcraft days. If you want to take the shaman and go on a ride from one of the simplest healers to play to maybe the most complex and satisfying DPSers in the game. And no RPG is complete with the dark version of any mage or caster or wizard, which is the Warlock for World of Warcraft. And you get to do all of the dark shenanigans you ever thought, from sucking souls away to summoning demons to rip and tear your enemies to pieces, or simply destroy the world on which they walk on. This is everything that the Warlock can do. You are essentially the Death Knight of casters. You are very mobile, but you are very tanky. Possibly the class with the most amount of HP in the game, save for the tanks. You have some of the strongest defensive abilities to survive any kind of damage. If you don't think you have the legs to move out of the way fast enough, you can just take it to the face and just heal it back, or simply just almost no damage by just popping your defensives. And if you really have to move, you have gateways to teleport you and your party or your raid across the battlefield, or even self-teleports through your demonic circles. And if you want to go full demonic, you can play the demonology spec, which essentially summons all of the demons imaginable to just tear your enemies a new one and give you the feel of that supreme demon commander. Destruction is probably one of the simplest casters in the game, but also one of the more satisfying ones, where you summon bolts of chaos magic, the most impactful spells in the game that just purely destroy reality around you when you see it, how they smash your enemies to pieces and call down infernal demons to wreak havoc on your enemies and just burn them alive. Or embrace the truly dark and sinister magics of Affliction Warlock, where you essentially curse your enemy, inflict agonizing pain with the most amount of damage over time abilities in the game, and then just drain their soul and heal yourself back up, because what better way to heal your life points by using another person's life points? that is the best way, truly. And you can do that with Affliction, the truly master of damage over time effects. And if controlling demons isn't satisfying enough, how about being one? The Demon Hunter is essentially what every warlock's dream is, where you can actually be a demon, or let's say a half demon, because you do contain the soul of a demon inside, and that makes you do some pretty gnarly stuff. You have only 2 specs to play with, but they are fun as hell. The Havoc Demon Hunter is essentially the melee DPS of the class, and you essentially slash and burn and destroy your enemies from within with some of the coolest and most demonic type abilities possible, while also metamorphosing, transforming into a big demon with big wings and big horns and big hoofs that just annihilates your enemies to pieces with your twin warglaives. And you are probably, I did say that the monk is maybe the most mobile class in the game, but the Demon Hunter is definitely the fastest one. Only class in Havoc, the only DPS spec that uses speed to deal damage with your Fel Rush abilities and all of the abilities that synergize with Fel Rush. This is the embodiment of the demonic speed that you've always wanted to have. Or you can also be a tank, because nothing says top right there than a big fat demon with spikes coming out of its back. This is essentially the metamorphosis of the Vengeance Demon Hunter spec, where you have a lot of demon spikes fired to burn your enemies and let you take less damage. You get to heal with the souls of your enemies and fill up your HP bar, or simply devastate them with insane breaths of fell magic while also filling your HP back up. Not to mention that as a tank, you are the most mobile tank possible, even more so than monk, with your infernal leaps all around the battlefield. This is essentially the excuse for any DPSers to actually play a tank while actually still playing a DPS spec. And last but not least, the other end of the trifecta for any RPG, the warrior class. Again, a vanilla class, but don't let that fool you, because warrior has some of the meatiest, most barbaric, brutal, and savage abilities out of all of the classes in the game. You will wield the biggest of weapons with the heaviest of armors and just use that all to smash into your opponents into raging colossus glory. You can play one of the 2 DPS specs, and you can embrace the power of the furious berserker and wield 2 two-handed weapons, the only spec in the game that can do that, and just use pure speed, strength, and rage to dominate your enemies and deal massive amounts of damage in a simplistic way, because you don't have to be an astrophysicist to enjoy a Fury Warrior. But you can also take it a little bit more tactical and play an Arms Warrior, where you wield only 1 big two-hander spec, but you get to clean. You get to slam some of the biggest single-hitting abilities in the game through Mortal Strikes and Execute, or spin in a blade storm of mayhem and bone-grinding mercilessness through Arms Warrior, the avatar of pure blade mastering madness. Or, as you might have thought, the true wielder of the shield, the Protection Warrior. This is the tank to play if you never knew how to tank, and if you thought all of these weird tanks are confusing. Just pick up your shield, press your shield block, and you will be blocking attacks that are hitting your shield. Pretty simple, right? You charge away, you build rage, and you just take no damage when you press your abilities. This is the warrior, and it can be yours for the small price of creating a new character, because this is all it takes to actually play an alt in the game. And if you thought playing alt is a pain and annoying, you literally don't know what's coming into alt that will make playing alt a lot easier, and you can check it in this video, where we tell you exactly why playing alt is so much fun and way better designed in Dragonflight.